Hello everyone, welcome to EEPS 1390 Planetary Surface Processes Lecture Review number 13. On today's agenda, we will be wrapping up chapter number 6, going into crater statistics and relative age dating, also known as chronology. We will explore portions of problem set 5, question number 2, and if you're interested in learning more about any of the topics discussed today, a key reference that I recommend is Galt 1970. So, a question that you could ask is, why do we use impact craters to understand chronology, or why do their statistics matter? And that's because many landscapes across the solar system are dominated by impact craters, and on some planetary bodies, we really only see impact craters. But these impact craters, they can provide us with some valuable insights into the ages of surfaces and the ages of major events in the solar system. So let's take that concept and look at the moon. So the moon is where chronology has been the most informative, not only to understanding the moon and its history, but also to the solar system as a whole. So what I've outlined here are all surface craters with a diameter of greater than 20 kilometers. On the left, you see the near side hemisphere, which is the portion of the moon that faces Earth at all times. And on the right, you see the far side hemisphere, the part that faces away from Earth that we cannot see from the surface. There are 4 major impact basins on the moon that really help pinpoint chronology. Those are South Pole Aitken Basin, or SPA, which is in the southern portion of the far side hemisphere. And on the near side, we have Imbrium, Serenitatis, and Nectaris, denoted with an I, S, and N on the left plot. I should also note that the surface craters are shown in yellow, and basins, which are the biggest of craters, are shown in blue and white for those identified with surface data, and magenta and white for those identified using gravity data. So once we have all of these craters, we can then start doing chronology and finding out the ages of different portions of the surface of the moon. And once we do that, we can actually take that to other planetary bodies. So there are a few ways that we do chronology for planetary bodies. One of those falls under the banner of relative chronology, and there are several ways to do relative chronology. One is using principles of superposition, which is as simple as it sounds. If we have 2 basins or craters next to each other and you see that one has ejecta on top of another, you know the one that's covered by ejecta must be older than the one that emplaced the ejecta. So this is the concept of relative chronology. And through this, we know that SPA is not only the largest impact basin on the moon, but it's also the oldest impact basin on the moon. Another way that we can do relative chronology is through what we refer to as cumulative crater density estimates. So this is where we look at the density of craters at a given portion of the surface. We compare it to another surface, and the region that has the densest crater estimate is the region that we generally think is older, relatively speaking. So cumulative crater density is normally shown in this format of N, and in parentheses D, where N represents that it's a cumulative crater density, and D indicates the diameter above which we're doing the cumulative crater count. So if this was N of 1, that means that this estimate would include all craters with diameters of greater than or equal to 1 kilometer. And we then, because this is a density, we reference it to areal density. Oftentimes we do this to 1,000,000 square kilometers, but this changes depending on the study. Another way that we do relative chronology is by looking at crater size frequency distributions, or SFDs for craters. And this is looking at the number of craters in a given diameter range across the whole diameter range of craters that are in a particular region, and comparing them. And similarly, if you see that a surface has a higher size frequency distribution on average, so for every bin size, if you will, or every diameter size, it has more craters compared to another region, you would generally say that the region with a higher crater size frequency distribution is in fact older. Of course, there's also absolute chronology. In absolute chronology, what we do is we take a basin or two, and with samples that we think date that basin, we come back and use techniques on Earth to date them, and then we use that to say, okay, we know a basin or two is older than, or approximately the age that we've measured. So for the moon, this is the only body where we've gone to and returned samples that have dated a very, very ancient terrain that we could then relate back to chronology. So for the moon, we believe we've only really constrained with absolute chronology 1 to 2 major basins. That's Oriental impact basin, which we think is the youngest impact basin on the moon, and that of Imbrium. And we believe these basins are less than 3.92 billion years old. So once you have absolute chronology and you also have relative chronology, you can actually use this together to infer absolute ages for surfaces in which you don't have samples from. And the way that you do this is by taking those crater density estimates and mapping those to absolute ages from samples that have been returned. So if you have a given surface where you know the absolute age and the relative age or the crater density, then what you can do is you can map that out and extrapolate the ages of other basins from that if you believe you know the cratering rate. So what you're looking at here is a plot of cumulative crater density on the y-axis for all craters greater than 1 kilometer in diameter, and you're looking at an absolute age on the x-axis going back to Earth-Moon system formation at around 4.5 billion years ago. And what you see is most of these calibrations shown here by the dots, some of them are inferred from samples that we've returned, but they don't necessarily date basins, so a lot of these are questionable. But what you see here is that a good chunk of what we believe we can constrain through absolute chronology is around that window between 3 and 4 billion years, and then younger than a billion years. So major portions of this curve are unconstrained. So this is a major outstanding issue in trying to do chronology for the moon and the solar system. Interestingly, this has some major implications for habitability, because in the window around 4 or 3.9 billion years and further back, this is where we think life might have arisen on Earth, where we have significant questions about atmospheric evolution, about exogenous water delivery. So constraining this curve best actually helps us precisely evaluate the circumstances for habitability across Earth and bodies across the solar system that we think might have been habitable in the past, like Mars. So based on this, there are a few different setups that we think might have explained the impactor mass flux into the solar system. And so I'm going to show a few of those here with impact mass flux on the y-axis and time before present on the x-axis. And this is an indicator of approximately the rate at which we're getting impacts into the inner solar system. So the simplest model is exponential decay. The farther that you go back in time, the larger the impact rate was. There's also the notion of a peak in late heavy bombardment that would have happened sometime around 3.9 billion years ago. The magnitude of this peak and the exact position of this peak is debated, and whether or not it exists is debated. But this is one model for solar system chronology. And then another that was more recently proposed is that of a sawtooth model, where somewhere around 4.2 billion years, there was a sudden increase in the amount of impactor mass that fluxed into the inner solar system that then exponentially decayed. And again, understanding each of these has different implications for the evolution of the inner solar system and implications for habitability. Now, before we dive into more, I want to talk about geometric crater saturation. So this was one of the concepts discussed in the book. And effectively, the way that geometric crater saturation is estimated is if you put craters side by side, in this instance, a crater of a certain diameter, and you don't overlap them, what's the maximum number of craters that you can fit on a surface? And what you find is that you can cover about 90% of the surface with craters. However, there'll be about 10% that's not covered. So that is what we call geometric crater saturation. However, this is never really achieved because craters don't line up so nicely. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go further into the lecture. So the book talked about concepts of crater counting and exactly how it worked. I generally prefer to use the term crater density estimation, because what we're actually doing is we're calculating densities. So this is one way that we do these crater density estimations. So what I'm showing here is North Ray crater, where a person has traced out the ejecta region associated with this crater and counted all craters within there, again excluding the impact site. So they're only looking at the surrounding ejected region to understand the age. And then from this, they calculate density, given that they can calculate the area. So what does a crater density plot look like? A cumulative crater density plot looks like this. Again, on the y-axis, we have the cumulative crater density. On the x-axis, we have crater diameter. This is on a log scale, as you notice, and sometimes this is the case with these where they're on a log-log plot. Other times they're on a semi-log plot, and sometimes they're not on a log plot at all. And what's shown here in the dashed line is geometric saturation. You can see that's much higher than the solid black line, which is a representation of the cumulative crater density for a region. And then what you also see is a partially dashed line below the geometric saturation that represents small crater equilibrium. So the concept of small crater equilibrium we'll discuss a bit more later. However, the general idea is, because we don't ever get to geometric saturation, is that there is a point at which you have an impact crater. On average, when it strikes the surface, it removes one crater that was previously there, so that your crater rate recorded on the surface cannot go higher. And that's in essence crater equilibrium. So when we look at the segments here, when we look at the crater curve here for the data, what was found in looking at several of these curves is that they can be matched by a function of the form shown on at the bottom of the slide, where n is equal to cd, and d is the diameter, where the diameter is raised to a negative b, and b being an exponent of d. And we're going to talk about exactly what that means and how different values for b can change our interpretations. And so this is a cumulative crater density plot. Another plot that we do, a relative or R plot, that really highlights differences in crater population. And it shows us how the slope of those lines that we saw on the log-log plot might change. Now, for these, there are some suggestions for how exactly you bin your crater diameters so as not to over or undersample particular regions, given that as you get to larger and larger crater sizes, you tend to have less craters. And as you get to smaller sizes, you have a lot of craters. So one way to balance that out is to use smaller bins at the smaller crater sizes and larger bins at the larger crater sizes. And effectively, that is what DGM, or diameter geometric mean, does. If you have two diameter if you have two edges to your diameter bins, dB and dA, you can then calculate a geometric mean for that diameter of the bin. And then from there, you can calculate the R value with the understanding that A is the representation of the area. Now, I will also say that this, given modern tools, is not used as much anymore. It's a great visual indicator of differences, but with more modern software and technology than used to exist when a lot of these methods were crafted, we can often use computers to detect very small imperceptible changes in those log-log plots. However, this is still a visually useful tool that is sometimes included in papers and publications. And the book goes into more about establishing particular bin sizes and the methods by which you would construct such an R plot. One way that we use to understand how cratering of a surface can evolve is by using analog models. Analog models are when we, in a lab setting, where we basically impact the surface using projectiles and we look at how the surface evolves. This is one example where we start off with a surface in the upper left-hand corner that has no craters, and we slowly progress and increasing the number of projectiles on the surface. What this particular plot is showing is projectors of different diameters that were shot or dropped into the analog lunar surface, and there are 6 different projectile sizes that hit this target. This target was made of quartz sand, and 10 craters were created in one size class for every 1 crater in the next larger size class. And the idea was to understand if what we see is representative of the lunar surface in any way. And here is a video now to understand how some of these analog lunar or analog cratering models work.
The countless craters on the surface of the Moon, which are telescopically visible from Earth, and the pitted surface revealed by recent lunar probes, attest to an intense bombardment by interplanetary debris over eons of time. Clearly, impact cratering has been a principal, if not the primary, agent for sculpturing and modifying the lunar topography. Although the principles of this process are well known and generally accepted, the evolutionary and morphological features of a surface formed by multiple impacts have proven difficult to comprehend and visualize. However, because the process is so basic to any interpretation of a lunar surface, an attempt has been made to simulate it in the laboratory. This simulation was recorded photographically, and it provides a remarkable demonstration of this critically important erosion and sedimentation process that is active on the lunar surface as the natural consequence of meteoroid impact. It must be emphasized that the terms erosion and sedimentation are used in the sense that lunar topographical features are continually modified, both by direct removal of a material as well as by the subsequent deposition of the eroded material via ballistic trajectories. What we shall depict here is the transition from a smooth, flat surface to one saturated with craters whose maximum diameter did not exceed 17 centimeters, so that as a full-scale replica, the entire sequence simulates a 1 to 10 year period on the Moon. The appearance of the surface changes rapidly at first, becoming more and more pitted and irregular until it reaches an equilibrium where only the location of the craters change, but not the general aspect. Careful studies of the photographic record reveal that the number of smaller craters reaches equilibrium first, followed in time by craters of larger and larger diameter. It follows that the number of craters of different size, observed after a significantly long interval of time, either in this experiment or on the lunar surface, is not a record of the number of craters that have been produced, but instead records the equilibrium number of craters of any given size. Individual craters, once formed, are obliterated, either suddenly by superposed impact or gradually through erosion by smaller projectiles and by deposition of ejecta from ballistic trajectories. They change regularly in form with time, from initially sharp craters to badly degraded, irregularly shaped depressions. The whole variety of geometric forms can be seen at any time, but it should be noted that the very sharp-appearing craters constitute only about 10% of the total number, which is in accord with what has been observed on the high-resolution Ranger, Surveyor, and Orbiter photographs of the Moon. Notwithstanding the many significant features revealed in this simulation, which we have called mare exemplum, it is important to emphasize that we were severely restricted in the laboratory by the presence of the atmosphere and by the fact that we could accommodate neither larger nor smaller craters in the model. The effect of these missing craters would have been to soften all contours and produce a far more subdued appearance for the surface relief. The lunar surface, revealed in the Ranger, Surveyor, and Orbiter pictures, has such a soft look. It is precisely what one might anticipate as a result of meteoroid bombardment for eons of time.
Okay, so hopefully that very old video was enjoyable. So let's go ahead and move forward. So what we've learned from that video, at least in part, is that not only do we have to be worried about craters erasing other craters from directly impacting on top of them, but also from degradation processes. Substantial degradation over time can remove rims, eventually fill in the crater, and ultimately lead to an erasure that's not due exclusively from an overprint. Now, we also do model versions of this, computational models, where we look at the evolution of surfaces. One very popular model that we use for this is called the crater terrain evolution model. There's an example of this here with elevation shown on the Suter color bar. And what you see is as we'll start off with this very deep, large crater at the center. And by only impacting maybe smaller craters than this, you'll see that that crater can eventually degrade to the point to where you end up in D, E, and F, where you don't even see that as a crater. There's some light depression, but for the most part, you don't see that crater anymore. So we are going to spend the rest of the time comparing or talking about crater distributions with respect to a D-2 distribution with the equation for the cumulative crater shown on the leftmost plot, where n cumulative equals some constant times D to the -2 power. And we're going to change that exponent, but the -2 distribution has some special properties that show up in planetary science that we often use to think about how a surface has evolved. Now, as an example of what the D-2 distribution means, on the bottom plot I show that it means if you have a crater of diameter D, then on that same surface you have 4 craters of diameter D divided by 2, or 16 craters of diameter D divided by 4, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, these are added onto a surface, and you can see in that bottom plot that this is what we're seeing on on several surfaces across planetary bodies, and in particularly the moon. Now, there are certainly instances in which we get slopes that are shallower. Some slopes we even see hitting 0 in some instances, as shown in the middle plot on the left. And sometimes we also see positive slopes, and those are all indicators of what's happening on that planet and what the impact or mass flux to a body looks like. And in terms of impact or mass flux, we're going to think about this in terms of a production size frequency distribution. So I'm going to be referring to that as a production curve. An example of that production curve is shown as the steeply sloped line here, also labeled as crater formation. And this is an instance in where the production curve is more steeply sloped than a D-2, D to the -2 curve. And D-2, I talked about how it's important, and we see this across the solar system. That's because this D-2 distribution matches up with saturation or saturation equilibrium. Again, this is not geometric saturation. Saturation is only a percentage of the geometric saturation, but it often follows this D-2 distribution. And so what can happen is if we have a production rate, shown here in the very steeply sloped line, when it crosses that saturation equilibrium, what ends up happening is craters don't get recorded above that, so you start to see a slope in the line. So if you take a look here at diameter D EQ on the x-axis, the solid line represents the observed crater curve, and you see that you get one slope that then sort of bends and changes slope. Now, oftentimes at D equilibrium, it won't be a sharp slope. You'll often see a curve when you look at cumulative crater curves. Again, on the y-axis here, this is the cumulative crater density, or cumulative crater number per unit area. And this is a log-log plot here. And what this implies is for those craters that are above that saturation equilibrium, it's not that they didn't impact, it's that they were removed or obliterated or erased and degraded, right? Okay, so let's now think about for a primary population that has a steeper production curve than the saturation line, what that looks like in temporal evolution. So on the left, it's time t equals 1, and on right is time t equals, or t sub 2. Left time t sub 1 and t sub 2 on the right. And these are showing how the surface observation changes for an unchanging production curve that's steeper than the saturation equilibrium curve. And what we see on the left is that equilibrium diameter highlighted on the x-axis is at a lower diameter at first. Again, you're seeing that curving when the production curve is passing that saturation equilibrium. And on the right, what ends up happening as more and more craters build up over time, that equilibrium diameter where you get that curving happens farther to the right or at larger diameters. So sometimes we can actually even think about the diameter at which the crater population has reached equilibrium and say something about relative ages or the crater statistics. So let's take a look at a cumulative crater distribution that builds up on in a computer model and see how the curve evolves. So the left plot here shows the cumulative crater distribution. Again, this is on a log-log plot, and on the x-axis we're showing crater diameter, and the pseudo color bar will represent the depth of the craters that we're seeing in the right plot in aerial view. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look. So what the dashed dotted lines again represent the saturation equilibrium. And what you see is that for very shallow diameters, we're hitting that pretty early. And then you'll see a big crater come in and that line will go down. This is the concept of impact catastrophe. You just saw that there. But you're sticking somewhere around that saturation equilibrium values. And you're not really seeing at the shallow that you're exceeding that. And as time moves forward, you're starting to see more of the larger crater diameters move into that saturation equilibrium range. So we can also look at a steeply sloped impactor population for an R plot. And I note this is a different model here. In this instance, the dashed dotted line represents the cumulative production. And the solid white line represents what we're able to observe or what's been preserved at the surface. So right now, we're starting to enter that equilibrium range. We see a shallowing out because it's hitting that -2 distribution. And as time moves forward, we start to notice that at larger and larger diameters, we get closer to saturation equilibrium as well. So now let's think about shallowly sloped impactor population. So this is, it's a lot less simple at what happens in this particular instance where the production curve is shallower than the saturation curve. But what you can see, at least from here, is that what it means is that larger craters should hit above that saturation limit prior to lower crater diameters. So let's go ahead and take a look at this first in terms of the crater cumulative distribution. And you see that the larger craters have hit saturation, right? And even exceeded that saturation equilibrium values. And that's because at very large diameters, even if much of the crater is erased, if we can see part of the rim and we can see part of the structure, we would normally count that. And what's happening at the the lower crater diameter end is this concept of impact catastrophe, where these very large craters are wiping out large swaths of these smaller craters, so they can never really build up and count. And that's why you see that fluctuation happening. So in this instance, it's going to be very, very hard to get to even the crater saturation equilibrium values. And that's why looking at this shallower production population is a lot more complex than thinking about the steeper crater population. Okay, so let's also look at this in terms of the R value. Again, what we're seeing in this instance is we're seeing very early the larger crater diameters. You're going to see them hitting the equilibrium or passing that crater saturation equilibrium values. And you'll see at the shallower end, you're not going to be reaching that due to impact catastrophe, where you're removing those small craters enough by these big craters that those values for lower crater diameters are just going to stay pretty low. Now we can also think about real impactor populations. So these are a lot more complex, and we're going to take a look at this through the lens of the near-Earth orbit population. On the x-axis is diameter shown in green, and on the y-axis is cumulative crater density. And what you see here in red is the number of craters discovered for this particular plot, August 2014. And you certainly see this curving over that's happening. Um, and I also highlighted here are a few major impacts that you may have heard about that have happened on Earth, some within our lifetime. And so, if we know that the production function, or we have good reason to believe the production function follows this dash blue line, what we see with the red line is that it shallows, right? So part of this is because on Earth, very similar to Mars and Venus, we have weathering, we have erosion. On Earth, we have plate tectonics, and so it's much easier to remove craters compared to the Moon. But when we take a look at the near Earth orbit population, what we see is that they do, shown by the circles here, follow very closely this constant power law. So what this is telling us is the things that would be impacting Earth are just not being preserved, rather than that they don't impact. I should also say that Earth's atmosphere plays a strong role in weeding out some of the impacts at smaller diameters too. Okay, so how about we go on and we take a look at cratered surface evolution. So how about we take a look at cratered surface evolution? So this is an example of a 10 million old surface compared to a 100 million year old surface. And looking at these respectively, it would be probably easy just from a, without even doing any crater density estimates, to tell that the image on the right is older from these crater density estimates because there are more craters, larger craters per unit area. Of course, we can go to even larger time steps. So on the left, we have this 100 million year plot, and on the right, we have a 1 billion year plot. And this starts to get a little bit harder because we start seeing more degradation of craters, right? And so that means that some of the craters we're not going to be able to count because we're not going to recognize so much as a crater. So these are some of the complexities that come up in crater age dating. And for problem set 5, question 2, there are several parts. We've covered most of the concepts in this lecture review, and many of them are covered in the book. So I think you should be able to answer them. Most of these are qualitative, but there are some applications applied to crater chronology curves, there are figures provided at the end of the homework. If you have any questions on the homework, you can certainly make an appointment with me to discuss. But I think this should be something, hopefully, that you're all able to walk through with the help of the book in this lecture review. So thank you for tuning in, and next week we will be in person.